In 1964, the United States was engaged in a naval encounter with some North Vietnamese torpedo boats. After the engagement, the United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing the U.S. to engage in war with the North Vietnamese without formally declaring war. Soon after, in 1965, the U.S. began sending troops and supplies into South Vietnam and began fighting against the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, and the Viet Cong. After the arrival of the first American troops in Vietnam, the U.S. began their defensive engagement tactics. Their purpose of this was to defend their incoming supplies and troops from North Vietnamese attacks and to buy time for their Army Engineer Corps to build bases and clear jungle throughout the South Vietnamese country. The dawn of the Vietnam War also brought about the use of new military tactics. These included air cavalry and heavy helicopter use, carrier-based air support, search and destroy tactics, and new generation aircraft design.
Arguably the most significant change from previous wars in the fighting style of the United States Armed Forces in Vietnam was the heavy use of helicopters. During the 50s, U.S. generals realized that with the advent of nuclear weapons, amphibious landings would be very vulnerable. Because of this, they asked the government to fund development of new transport helicopters that could be used to put troops directly onto the battlefield without needing a secure landing zone. In response, the military funded the research for and then purchased helicopters that could fill this role. In 1965, the Bell UH-1 Huey was phasing out older helicopters and proving highly successful in Vietnam. Infantry divisions that were designated for air assault were formed into new air cavalry divisions that were trained and equipped specifically for being transported into battle in helicopters and fighting from both the interior of the helicopters and on the ground. The air cavalry proved their success early on in the Battle of La Drang Valley, where the 1st Air Cavalry Division engaged and defeated several numerically superior NVA regiments and stormed a major command post. Helicopters also took new roles, like heavy transport roles, medical evacuation, also known as dust-offs, close air support, and search and rescue missions. They also dropped chemicals like Agent Orange to help defoliate the thick jungle. New advancements in radio and aircraft technology since the Korean War had revolutionized aircraft. Improved radios meant that ground troops could now communicate directly with aircraft. Additionally, new precision weapons and aiming devices meant it was very feasible for fighter-bomber aircraft to provide quick, accurate, and effective support to troops on the ground. New fighters like the F-4 Phantom had both radio-guided and heat-seeking missiles. Fighter-bombers proved vulnerable to SAM sites on the ground, but were still used extensively throughout the war. The B-52 bomber played a large role in the war, kicking off Operation Rolling Thunder by dropping tons of bombs on North Vietnam and Laos. Operation Rolling Thunder would continue throughout the war, becoming the primary means of hitting enemy supply lines.
I got to beware. I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Public opinion played a large and new role in Vietnam. For the first time, viewers could simply watch their TVs and see an uncensored view of the war that had not previously been available to them. From the get-go, public opinion was somewhat mixed. In the early 60s, covert U.S. forces and CIA-sponsored Thai mercenaries were operating in North Vietnam. But the Vietnam operations finally became public after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Although it was not officially confirmed as fact until 2005, the second of the 2 engagements in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was the pretext for starting the war, never actually happened, and the clear uncertainty in the reports was disregarded by White House officials. As early as 1965, both President Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara hinted at this, although neither one publicly admitted it until many years later. In addition, a new counterculture began to form amongst the nation's youth, They protested the war and pushed for values like peace and love instead of fighting.
Let it shine, let it
A major turning point for public opinion was the Tet Offensive. Americans had just been assured that things were under control in Vietnam and our involvement would be winding down soon. When they saw many Americans being killed and major battles going on, they felt like they had been lied to by the government and felt like the war would drag on for many years longer. The draft also turned public opinion against the war. Many people were already against the war and felt it was unfair for them to be forced to fight in a war they did not agree with. Furthermore, especially early on in the draft, there were policies allowing college students to avoid the draft to continue education. Low-income families and minorities found this unfair because while their kids were forced to fight and had no way out of it, families that could afford college simply had to send their kids to college to avoid the draft.
I wanna tell you how it's gonna be. You're gonna give your love to me.
As public opinion declined, several battles led to the eventual withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a surprise attack by the VC and NVA on the Vietnamese holiday of Tet. The attack was widespread, hitting U.S. bases all across South Vietnam and storming the U.S. Embassy and government buildings in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. After several days, the attack was finally driven off by U.S. forces at a very high cost to the NVA. Despite decisive military victory, the U.S. public began to lose support for the war because the media focused mainly on U.S. losses.
It became a system where the army, the people who were fighting the war over there, were the ones who were blamed for everything that happened.
Love for real, not fade away. Not fade away.
The United States began pulling out troops in 1973. Ceasefire talks began, but when the Communists saw it was not going to be to their advantage, they broke off the talks and resumed offensives in 1974. Reduced U.S. strength allowed them to retake much of the territory they had lost over the previous years. By 1975, they were advancing upon Saigon. Mass helicopter evacuations began as the final U.S. troops and officials pulled out of Vietnam, with many South Vietnamese civilians in some of the largest aerial evacuations in history. On April 25, 100,000 NVA encircled 30,000 ARVN troops defending Saigon. On April 29th, the last of the U.S. Marines and diplomats were pulled out in Operation Frequent Wind, arguably the largest helicopter evacuation ever. On April 30th, NVA forces surged through the ARVN defenses and captured Saigon. South Vietnam surrendered, and North and South Vietnam merged under North Vietnamese communist rule. In the end, the Vietnam War wound up spanning 10 years and taking the lives of 58,000 U.S. soldiers and countless Vietnamese civilians. It is one of the longest wars in U.S. history and one of the most controversial. Even today, many years after the end of the conflict, people still question whether or not we should have been involved in Vietnam. While there is no one definitive answer to this question, what we can say for sure is that the Vietnam War helped define a generation and will not be forgotten anytime soon.
Perhaps they're better left unsung. I don't know. Don't really care. Let there be songs to fill the air.